Welcome, Trick Trackers. I'm Scott Taggart, and I've created a series of videos to walk you through the creation and use of the TrickTracks custom navigation maps for Garmin GPS devices. I'm making these videos from the world headquarters of the TrickTrack Development Labs. Let's get started. Welcome back, Trick Trackers. This video, I'll discuss TrickTracks configuration. Now, this is quite a detailed and in-depth discussion of all the features that are buried in TrickTracks that you might want to use. So bear with me, and this is considered for advanced users with one exception, and that is if you have Zumo devices, you will have to use one very small part of this if you want the lines to look correctly. So to get into configuration, by the way, you can get more information about configuration by clicking here for written documentation. I'm not going to go into that. So click the Configure button, and you'll see that the window pane expands. And then in each of these areas, there's a plus and a minus, and if you click them, they expand and contract as you click. So they're toggles. So let's talk first about tracks. And the default values of TrickTracks are generally what you want, but you do have control over all of this. So the default track width is 16 pixels wide. Now that's generally a good value for most devices. However, some devices the tracks show either too wide or too narrow, and you could change that. And I don't remember the minimum here, but it's probably something like 2, and the maximum I think is 24 or 32. Again, you can wiggle these or you can type them. Again, if a GPX file has track information or has track width information, this toggle, if you turn this off, then TrickTracks would obey whatever the track width is in the GPX file. Generally, we would leave this on, and it just forces all tracks to be whatever width we have here. Now, this is track arrow style, is what the arrows look like on the device. The default is this first one, and it generally works very well for the Montana, the older Montana series. However, for the Zumos, because the displays are a little bit different aspect ratio, we've had to put in some custom line values, and either the Zumo XT or the Zumo XT2 value here will work great. So if you select this and then create your maps with your GPX files using this value, you'll see that the lines look much better. I'll show you that a little later in this video. But anyway, you just pull that down and select whichever one you want. These are more experimental and probably work better on the older Montanas. Again, I'm not going to talk about them. You could fool with them if you wanted to, but really the top one and the Zumo XT. Reminder here that any values you configure, including your access code, will survive exiting and coming back into the browser, as well as rebooting your PC or your Mac. So there's no need to set these each time unless if you are switching back and forth between making maps for different devices like I do. All right, now this checkbox is, if you check it, if you leave it unchecked, you're going to get essentially this pattern, magenta. That's assuming the line was magenta colored. The lines actually follow whatever the track color is in the GPX file, if there is a track color. You'd get magenta with a black chevron. If you click this checkbox, you're going to get essentially black with a magenta arrow. All right, so it inverts the pattern. You can fool with it. I don't usually use it. This option, in the past, black track lines generated arrows that went both ways on the device. They had chevrons that went both ways, and the black lines were traditionally used to mean out back, out black. Get it? So, like if you're going to direct somebody to go out to a gas station 5 miles away, you'd put a black track line in, and then when they saw it, they'd see the arrows going both ways, and they would kind of know, oh, that's a bidirectional line. We took that default out for black and made it an option here. So if you want black lines to honor that double direction chevron, check this. The default for TrickTracks regarding track line color is to honor the color that's in the file itself. Now, if there's no color at all, the color defaults to magenta. That's if there's no color information at all in the file. But let's say the file GPX tracks have green, blue, and red for different track lines. If you leave this as don't force the color, you'll get the colors, green, blue, and red. If you say force the color, say you wanted them all to appear as green lines, you would select green, and now the green and the blue and the red would all be green. Now, I would not recommend this, but maybe in some situations it makes sense to do that. So the default is don't change the track color from the GPX file. If there is no track color, you'll get magenta by default, but you can also force it to any color you want. So that's how that works. Now, remember that the chevrons show in the direction of the track line itself. So if the track line went from south to north, the arrows would be pointed sort of, from south to north. The tip of the arrow would be to the north end of the chevron of the track. If you click reverse track directions, all those chevrons will be reversed. So if it was south to north, now they'll be look north to south. That might be really handy if you had a GPX file and you wanted to reverse all of the track directions. You could click this. Again, I don't use it very often, but it's there. All right, the next area we'll talk about configuration is the distance markers, or what we call the mileage markers. So if we expand this area, we see that the first option we have is to draw or not draw the distance markers. The default is on, which draws the markers, and the units are miles. If you click this, you'll get kilometers. All right, the default distances is specified here. So it's 5.0, and if it's miles, it's miles. If you select kilometers, you'll get kilometers. You can set this to anything you want. I don't remember the minimum, but it wouldn't make sense to set it too low because then the markers would all overlap. But 5 is a good value, 10 might be a good value. The next configuration area says marker label prefixed, and it shows as blank. The default prefix, if you have nothing in here, is the word mile. So for example, mile 5, mile 10, mile 20. If you were to select kilometers, it would say km 5, km 20 if you leave this blank. You can, however, put anything you want in here. You could put that, and that'll prefix each of the markers. Normally you'd leave this blank and you'll get the word mile or km. This is the number of marker rings around the mileage, and the default is 1, and that's generally acceptable. So as an example, I put the value 3 in here, and let me flip. I made a map with this. Let me flip over to Basecamp real quick, and you can see now that the mileage marker has 3 rings around it. I believe these are 400-meter rings. So instead of a single ring, you've got 2 rings, 2 additional rings, and at 400 each, this would be 1 mile from the center of the mileage marker. That might be handy for some things. Again, they go away if you zoom out too far on the device. Generally, you want to leave this as 1. Oh, there we go. The diameter of each ring is 400. That's the default. So you could change that too, even if you leave this at 1. You could make them smaller or bigger. So if you wanted a 1 mile single ring, you could change this to 1600 meters. All right, we're back. So we were discussing the draw distance marker options, and this particular checkbox is by default on, and it says the distance marker lines, that's the outside lines, are transparent, which is normally what we want. I'm going to turn this off, as well as turn this draw distance markers even if they overlap targets on, and I'm going to show you a map. So this one says if a distance marker pentagon, the 6-sided marker, were to overlap a target, it would now allow it to overlap the target, but the default is that they will not be drawn. So sometimes the mileage markers will be missing if they happen to fall in or near a target. So I created a map. I've checked these, turned this off, and turned this one on. Now we'll go over to Basecamp and show you what it looks like. So here's a mileage marker. Oh, I should let me go back real quick, and I had also set this to green. You can set the perimeter line on the distance markers to be any color you want, and I had set it to green. So let's go look at that too. All right, so we see a line that we normally don't see on the outside edge of a distance marker. We see that it's green, and so that's those two settings. Let's go to find a marker now where it overlaps with a target, and you can see here that this target, this mileage marker happened to fall in the center of this target, and it is drawn. Now with this setting, with this draw distance markers, even if they overlap, if this is turned off, which is the default, then that mileage marker would not have been drawn. The final setting here is the distance marker shading, which is default to medium. You can set it to off, which would mean the distance marker would be hollow. You could set it to a light shading or heavy shading. I'm not going to demonstrate that. Normally, we just leave these as a default. So let's jump into targets and configuration of targets. All right, now let's jump into target configuration. We select the expansion box here to see these. The first one is the shading density in the center of the target. The default is medium. Again, you can go none, light, medium, or heavy. Default is medium. And that affects this, what this shading in here looks like in the target. This is medium. If you go with heavy, it would be much darker than this, and light would be lighter, and then of course none. There would be no shading at all. Again, default is medium. Probably wouldn't change it, but you could experiment with that. The target ring spacing defaults to 400 meters, quarter mile, and for each ring in the target, if it's a green target, it'll have one ring, a blue target will have two rings, and a red target will have three rings, although the spacing is a bit non-linear there. Let's look at a target. So here's a quarter mile target, which was a green dot, green solid. I'll show you that here. There's a green, here's a red, and let's see if I can find a blue here. Do I have a blue? Yeah, here's a blue. So here's the two target rings, starting from the center. Ignore this smaller one because that was another waypoint. You've got your quarter mile ring and your half mile ring. And then on the solid dot, you've got a quarter mile, a half mile, and a 1 mile. So the distance here is 400, 800, and then another 800. So the ring distance is basically double. And this particular setting says how many target rings for each unknown target waypoint type. So the waypoints that TrickTracks cares about, so to speak, or looks at as special are the green, blue, and red solid dots, and then the warning markers, which we'll talk about later as the triangles. If it's any waypoint besides those, then this is the number of rings that get drawn for an unknown waypoint type. If you put this as 0, you'll get no rings at all. The default is 1. So let me show you that. I had a few of those here. In fact, there was one right here. This is a little bit of a bad example because it's a target inside a target, but this is a hotel waypoint here. You can see this smaller 200 meter ring, and that is for what we call an unknown waypoint, meaning anything besides the known ones. I don't think I have any others on here. No, I don't. So that's what that setting is for. That's how many rings get drawn. If you set this to 2 or 3 or 4, then an unknown waypoint would draw as many rings as you specify. All right, this option here, shade center target circle, controls whether the very inner perimeter of the target is shaded. The default is off. I'm going to turn it on and then show you what it looks like in Basecamp. I've created a map with that option set. Here's some waypoints. I'll zoom into the center, and you can see that there's no red ring. There's just this shaded pattern that indicates the very center of the target. I don't find this very useful, but it is an option. So that's what that is. All right, that wraps up targets. We're going to move into warning markers. All right, we're back. Warning markers, those are the triangular waypoints that end up with triangular, they're not targets, but they're markers. So let me show you that real quick. Here are the warning markers. If you drop a green triangle waypoint, you get a quarter mile triangle. If you drop a blue, you get a half mile, 2 polygon triangle. And if you drop a red, you get a 1 mile 3 ring triangle marker. So these are called warning markers. We showed them before. Now, again, let me just show you really quickly what they look like in uh, base camp as a. This is what they look like for waypoints. So green, blue, and red. So the draw warning markers, if it's by default, it's checked, and if you happen to use those triangular waypoints in your GPX file, you'll get those markers, and you'll get a label on them that prefixes with the word warn : You could change this to anything you want. You could leave it blank. If you don't want those warning markers, you would turn this off. Again, that would only be if you use those triangular waypoints. Almost nobody does, and so in general, you can ignore these. Now, let's say you've been configuring all these things and you've been experimenting and fooling around because you're an advanced TrickTrack user, and you've kind of gotten goofed up. You're not sure where everything should be. We have this bailout button, reset all configuration values. If you click this, everything gets set back. It kind of reinitializes TrickTracks, and everything will be back to the way it was, all the defaults. So that's your bailout if things get really confusing. So let's collapse this and talk about one last thing, which is diagnostics. Now, this is only for the developers of TrickTracks, and these are magic things that get entered in case if we have to debug or work on the software. So in general, you can ignore them. So that wraps up configuration. That pretty much covers it, and you should be good to go. You're always welcome to contact us and ask questions. In particular, if you have bugs or you see things that don't work right, click on the contact us and send us an email.